Officer Rick Wallace had been with the Cedar Ridge Police Department for nearly 15 years. He was the kind of cop who thought he had everything figured out. Rick believed in trusting his instincts, even if they were sometimes clouded by biases he refused to acknowledge. To him, anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of normal was immediately suspicious. That morning, the streets of Cedar Ridge were unusually quiet. Rick's patrol car cruised through the town as he sipped his coffee, eyes scanning for anything out of place. He often said he could smell trouble, and today he was convinced he'd find it. This is just the beginning of a story filled with tension, injustice, and a powerful lesson that will leave you speechless. If you've ever felt frustrated by people who act on their assumptions instead of the truth, keep watching. There's so much more to uncover. Like, share, and subscribe to ensure stories like this reach more people. Together, we can raise awareness and spark the conversations that lead to real change. Don't miss what happens next. As he passed a popular diner, his eyes locked onto a sleek black car parked near the back of the lot. Inside, two black men in suits sat talking. Their body language seemed intense, their heads nodding and their gestures animated. Rick's mind immediately jumped to conclusions. Drug deal? He muttered to himself. Something shady for sure. He made a U-turn and pulled into the diner's parking lot, his patrol car's lights flashing. The sound of the siren cut through the peaceful morning air, drawing the attention of a few diners enjoying their breakfast on the patio. Conversation stopped as all eyes turned toward the scene. Inside the car, Captains Darnell Johnson and Michael Carter were finalizing the agenda for the upcoming police reform conference. Both men had spent years advocating for fair policing and were well respected across the state. This conference was a crucial step in their mission to build trust between police departments and the communities they served. Looks like someone's curious, Darnell said with a sigh, glancing at the flashing lights in the rearview mirror. Michael frowned. Let's see what this is about. Stay calm. Rick approached the car, his hand resting on his holster. Roll down the window, he barked. Darnell obliged, his calm demeanor masking his growing frustration. Good morning, officer. Is there a problem? Rick didn't answer. Instead, his eyes darted between the two men and the interior of the car, searching for something, anything that could justify his suspicion. License and registration, he said curtly. Michael held up his badge. Officer, I'm Captain Michael Carter, and this is Captain Darnell Johnson. We're visiting Cedar Ridge for official business. Is there a reason you stopped us? Rick barely glanced at the badge. I don't care what you claim to be, he snapped. Step out of the vehicle, both of you. Darnell's patience began to wear thin. Officer, you're making a mistake. I said, step out, Rick interrupted, his tone sharp and uncompromising. With no other choice, the two men stepped out of the car, their movements deliberate and calm. Rick immediately began to pat them down, his rough treatment drawing murmurs from the small crowd that had gathered. What's going on here? A diner employee whispered to a coworker. I don't know, but those guys don't look like criminal, the coworker replied. They're wearing suits. Rick ignored the murmurs, cuffing Darnell and Michael as if they were dangerous suspects. You're both coming with me, he declared. This is outrageous, Michael said, his voice tinged with disbelief. We've done nothing wrong. Rick smirked. That's not for you to decide. The trip to the Cedar Ridge Police Department felt surreal for Captains Darnell Johnson and Michael Carter. Sitting cuffed in the back of a patrol car, both men exchanged looks of disbelief and simmering anger. They had dedicated their careers to building bridges between communities and law enforcement. Yet here they were, treated like criminals by one of their own. This is unbelievable, Darnell muttered under his breath. We're captains, for crying out loud. Michael leaned back, keeping his voice calm but firm. Let's keep cool. He's digging his own grave. Outside the station, the small-town police department looked unassuming, its modest brick exterior giving no hint of the storm brewing inside. Officer Rick Wallace parked his patrol car with a sense of triumph. As he led the two men through the station doors, he held his head high, as if parading a major catch. Inside the station, Rick marched Darnell and Michael past rows of desks. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, and whispers began circulating. It wasn't every day that two sharply dressed men in handcuffs were brought in. Who are they? One officer murmured. No idea. another replied. But they don't look like the usual suspects. Darnell and Michael kept their composure, even as Rick spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. I've got 2 suspects detained for suspicious activity. They were loitering in a vehicle at the diner. Suspicious activity? Darnell said under his breath, incredulous. We were sitting in a car having a conversation. Rick ignored him and pushed the men toward the booking area. He was already imagining the commendation he might receive for catching potential criminals in his town. Behind the booking desk stood Frank Delaney, the station's seasoned sergeant. Frank was in his 60s, a man who had seen it all and didn't have the patience for theatrics. As Rick approached, Frank glanced at the 2 men and froze. Rick, Frank said slowly, what's going on here? Rick puffed out his chest. Found these 2 acting suspicious in the diner parking lot. Thought I'd bring them in to check things out. Frank's eyes narrowed as he studied Darnell and Michael. Something about their confident posture and calm expressions didn't match Rick's story. Suspicious how? Frank asked. They were sitting in a car, looking out of place, Rick replied. Might be part of something bigger. Darnell stepped forward, his hand still cuffed. Sergeant, my name is Captain Darnell Johnson, and this is Captain Michael Carter. We're with the Central Division. We're here on official business. Frank's jaw tightened. Captains? He turned to Rick. Did you check their IDs? Rick shrugged dismissively. Yeah, they showed me some badges, but anyone can fake those. Frank sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. Rick, do you realize what you've done? They look suspicious, Rick argued, his tone defensive. Frank glared at him. Suspicious? Rick, you've just arrested 2 captains who've probably worked harder in their careers than you ever will. Rick's face turned red, but he doubled down. I was just doing my job. They don't belong here. Frank shook his head, his frustration boiling over. You mean they didn't fit your idea of who belongs? Rick ignored Frank's reprimand and placed Darnell and Michael in a holding cell. You'll stay here until we sort this out, he said curtly. Michael leaned against the cell bars, his voice icy. Do you have any idea what's about to happen? Rick smirked. Yeah, I'm about to close the case. Darnell shook his head. No, Officer Wallace, you're about to be the case. As the door clanged shut, Rick walked away, oblivious to the storm brewing outside the station. The young woman at the diner who recorded the arrest had wasted no time uploading the footage to social media. Within hours, the video had gone viral, spreading like wildfire across platforms. The hashtags number injustice profiling and number justice for captains began trending. The video showed everything. Rick's aggressive approach, the disrespectful dismissal of Darnell and Michael's credentials, and the growing crowd's outrage. These men were just sitting in their car, the woman's voice said in the background. This is so wrong. Across the state, phones began buzzing. Reporters, activists, and even government officials saw the video. Chief Sandra Reyes of Cedar Ridge Police Department was in the middle of a meeting with the town's mayor when her phone lit up with a dozen messages. What's going on? The mayor asked, noticing her grim expression. Chief Reyes played the video. Her face hardened as she watched Rick cuffing 2 of the most respected captains in the state. Oh no, she muttered, standing up abruptly. This is bad. Really bad. The mayor leaned forward, his brow furrowing. Do something. Now Chief Reyes didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her car keys and headed for the station, her mind racing. She knew Rick's impulsive nature, but this crossed a line she couldn't ignore. As she drove, her phone rang continuously. Calls from reporters, colleagues, and even the state commissioner. Not now, she muttered, her grip tightening on the wheel. I have to fix this before it gets worse. By the time Chief Reyes arrived at the station, a small crowd of reporters and protesters had gathered outside. Signs reading End Injustice. Profiling and justice for all waved in the air, their messages clear and bold. Inside, Rick sat at his desk, oblivious to the chaos. He was filling out paperwork, confident he'd handled the situation perfectly. He had no idea that his actions had already ignited a firestorm. Chief Reyes stormed into the building, her presence like a thunderclap. Officers stood at attention as she passed, sensing the gravity of her mood. She headed straight for Rick. Wallace, she barked, her voice sharp enough to make him jump. In my office. Now Rick blinked, confused by her tone. Chief, is something wrong? You don't even know the half of it, she said, her eyes blazing. Let's talk. Chief Sandra Reyes's office door slammed shut behind Officer Rick Wallace, the sound reverberating through the station. Rick stood awkwardly, his confidence waning under her piercing glare. The usually composed Chief Reyes was visibly furious, her hands resting on the desk as she leaned toward him. Do you have any idea what you've done? She demanded, her voice low but loaded with anger. Rick frowned, still not grasping the gravity of the situation. Chief, I was just doing my job. Those guys look suspicious. Suspicious? Chief Reyes repeated, her voice rising. Those guys are Captain Darnell Johnson and Captain Michael Carter, two of the highest-ranking and most respected officers in this state. You arrested them like common criminals. Rick's face flushed red, a mix of embarrassment and defiance. How was I supposed to know? They didn't act like captains. They didn't act like captains? Chief Reyes echoed, incredulous. What does that even mean? Because they were black? Because they were sitting in a nice car in a diner parking lot? Is that your threshold for suspicion? Rick opened his mouth to reply but couldn't find the words. The chief wasn't done. Do you realize the entire country is watching us right now? She continued, holding up her phone. This video is viral, Rick. Viral? Reporters are outside this building as we speak. The mayor is breathing down my neck. The state commissioner is demanding answers. And all of this, every single piece of it, is because you acted on your biases instead of doing your job properly. Rick shifted uncomfortably, his bravado completely gone. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Chief Reyes narrowed her eyes. It shouldn't have gone anywhere. You dismissed their badges. You ignored their credentials. You cuffed two innocent men and marched them through this station like trophies. You've embarrassed this department and damaged our relationship with the community. While Chief Reyes tore into Rick, Sergeant Frank Delaney was busy rectifying the mess. He personally escorted Captains Darnell Johnson and Michael Carter out of the holding cell. Captains, he said, his tone filled with regret. I can't even begin to apologize for what's happened here. This was a huge mistake. Darnell adjusted his suit jacket, his expression unreadable. A mistake? That's what we're calling this? Michael stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Sergeant, what happened here is more than a mistake. It's a symptom of a larger problem, one we've been trying to address for years, and now we're living it firsthand. Frank nodded solemnly. I understand. Chief Reyes is handling the situation, and I assure you, Officer Wallace will be held accountable. Darnell and Michael walked through the station's main hall, their heads held high despite the humiliation they had endured. Officers they passed looked away, guilt evident in their expressions. As they exited the building, the scene outside was chaotic. Reporters with cameras and microphones swarmed, shouting questions, while protesters chanted and held up signs demanding justice. Michael raised a hand to quiet the crowd. We'll address this shortly, he said. Right now, we need to have a word with the chief. Chief Reyes had just finished reprimanding Rick when her assistant knocked on the door. Chief, the captains are here to see you. Reyes nodded, her face softening slightly. Send them in. Darnell and Michael entered, their presence commanding. Rick stiffened, his eyes darting to the floor as the captains walked past him. Captains, Reyes began, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for what you've been through. This situation is unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the actions of my officer. Darnell's expression was stern. Chief, we've been in law enforcement long enough to know how these things start and how they're usually swept under the rug. That's not happening this time. Michael crossed his arms. This isn't just about us. It's about every person who's been profiled, every person who's been treated like a suspect because of how they look. We were lucky because we have badges. Most people don't. Reyes nodded. You're absolutely right. I've already initiated an internal investigation, and Officer Wallace has been suspended pending review. That's a start, Darnell said, but it's not enough. What do you have in mind? Reyes asked. Darnell leaned forward. We want mandatory bias training for every officer in this department. We want a review of all past arrests and complaints related to racial profiling, and we want to work directly with you to implement reforms that ensure something like this never happens again. Reyes didn't hesitate. Agreed. Whatever it takes to fix this. Rick's jaw dropped. Chief, you're letting them dictate policy now? Reyes turned to Rick, her eyes cold. They're not dictating anything. They're helping us rebuild the trust you've destroyed. Rick's suspension was immediate, and the investigation into his actions began the same day. As news of the incident spread, the public outcry grew louder. Community leaders called for systemic changes, using the captain's experience as a rallying cry for reform. Meanwhile, Darnell and Michael worked tirelessly alongside Chief Reyes to address the department's shortcomings. They held town hall meetings, spoke with residents, and ensured that every officer understood the importance of fair treatment for all. But the consequences for Rick didn't end with his suspension. Weeks later, the department's review board ruled against him. He was terminated for misconduct, and his case became a cautionary tale for law enforcement agencies across the state. At a press conference weeks after the incident, Captains Johnson and Carter addressed the public. This experience was painful, Darnell said, his voice steady. But it's also been a reminder of why we do this work. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. Michael added, this isn't just about us. It's about creating a world where no one has to fear being judged by their appearance. That's the future we're fighting for. As the crowd erupted in applause, Rick watched the broadcast from his small apartment, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Rick Wallace sat in his dimly lit apartment, the glow of the television casting flickering shadows across the room. The news report replayed the moment Captains Darnell Johnson and Michael Carter stepped out of the police station, their dignified composure contrasting sharply with his own shameful behavior. The words of the captains echoed in his mind. This isn't just about us. It's about ensuring no one is treated unfairly because of who they are. For the first time, Rick felt the weight of his actions, not just the professional fallout, but the personal reckoning. He had spent years patrolling the streets, convinced he was keeping his community safe. But now he saw the cracks in his own perspective, the damage he'd caused by relying on assumptions instead of facts. In the weeks following the incident, Cedar Ridge underwent a transformation. The public outcry led to sweeping changes in the police department. Bias training sessions became mandatory, and every officer was required to attend community engagement workshops led by Captains Johnson and Carter. The captains didn't stop there. They launched an initiative called Bridge the Badge, a program aimed at fostering trust between police officers and the communities they serve. The initiative included open forums, ride-along programs for citizens, and mentorship opportunities for young people interested in law enforcement careers. The first forum was packed with residents eager to voice their concerns. Darnell and Michael listened intently as people shared their stories of profiling, fear, and frustration. But there were also moments of hope, stories of officers who had gone above and beyond to help their community. This is what change looks like, Michael said at the end of the forum. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Rick was not immune to the changes sweeping through Cedar Ridge. Though he had been terminated, he was invited to attend the bias training as a civilian. Initially resistant, he decided to go after weeks of soul-searching. The training sessions were intense, forcing him to confront the unconscious biases he had carried for years. It wasn't easy, but Rick knew he needed to do the work if he ever wanted to move forward. At one of the Bridge the Badge forums, Rick decided to speak publicly for the first time since the incident. I was wrong, he said, his voice trembling but sincere. I let my assumptions guide me, and I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to make sure I never repeat those mistakes. The room was silent for a moment before Darnell stood and approached him. Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, he said, extending a hand. Now it's about what you do next. Rick shook his hand, tears welling in his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Months turned into a year, and Cedar Ridge became a model of reform for other towns. Police departments from across the state visited to learn from their initiatives, and the captain's work gained national attention. They were invited to speak at conferences, sharing their story and the lessons learned from the incident. But for Darnell and Michael, the true victory was in the community's transformation. The trust that had been broken was slowly being rebuilt. Children who once feared the sight of a patrol car now waved at officers as they passed by. Residents who felt unheard now had a platform to share their concerns. Rick, now working as a community volunteer, became an advocate for reform himself. He spoke to new recruits about the dangers of bias and the importance of accountability. This isn't just about doing your job, he told them. It's about serving people with dignity and respect. The story of Cedar Ridge is a reminder that change is possible, but it starts with us, our actions, our willingness to listen, and our courage to confront uncomfortable truths. It's a story of accountability, redemption, and the power of community. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to keep the conversation alive. Together, we can build a world where everyone is treated with fairness and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. Change starts with awareness, but it grows through action. Let's be the difference.